Hi everyone, and thank you for joining this session about the perception and about the way in which the brain constructs reality. I want to start by saying that, in my opinion, perception is certainly the most fascinating phenomenon studied by neuroscience, and it's the most striking thing that the brain does. Everything we see, hear, feel, desire, dream, love, imagine, all of it is how we experience reality and life. We assume that we see everything there is to see, that our opinions, our goals, our choices all arise from our conscious will and from reasons that we know and we can explain. And we are a person with rational choices guided by the principles of a single personality and a single self. And it's hard to imagine that things could actually be any other way. Yes, it's normal for memory to seem like something with high accuracy, like a film recording by our visual system, which is normal to feel like a camera that captures every detail of a scene with precision. And yes, it's normal to believe that we are in control of what we perceive, and it might seem completely unnatural to think that some subliminal things, some particularly subtle details, can secretly shape or transform the entire way we perceive something. And it may seem completely counterintuitive to know that the visual system is not constructing perception based on all the information that is out there at any given time. But in fact, what we see outside is built on anticipation and predictions of particularly complex systems in the brain. It may seem strange to know that something as seemingly stable and rigorous as memory could be manipulated by something as subtle as a word. Some of the most important discoveries about the fallibility of memory come from the pioneering work of Professor Elizabeth Loftus at the University of California. Loftus devised an experiment in which she invited volunteers to watch a film of car crashes and then asked them a series of questions to test what they remembered. But the interesting thing is that the questions she asked influenced the answers she received. She explains, quote, "When I asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other versus how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, witnesses give different estimates of speed. They thought the cars were going faster when I used the word smashed," end quote. So the subjects thought the cars were going faster just based on a single word, and their visual system registered the scene with the car crash, absorbed the information, drew conclusions about speed, and yet the way a single word changed in the question altered the conscious experience of that memory, causing the subjects to remember something other than what they had seen, and to do so with the certainty of a perception they believed to be true. And it's very interesting to think about what implications this might have for eyewitnesses answering questions with details after witnessing a crime, for example, and how the way the police asks the questions can influence the perception of the memory. Elizabeth Loftus was intrigued by the way that leading questions could contaminate memory, so she decided to go even further. Would it be possible to implant in subjects completely new but false memories? Loftus recruited a selection of participants and had her team contact their family in order to get information about events in their past. And armed with this information, researchers put together 4 stories about each participant's childhood. 3 stories were true, and the 4th story contained plausible information, but was entirely made up. And the 4th story was about getting lost in a shopping mall as a child, being found by a kind elderly person, and finally being reunited with a parent. In a series of interviews, participants were told the 4th stories. At least a quarter of them claimed they could remember the incident of being lost in the mall, even though it hadn't actually happened. And fascinatingly, it didn't stop there. Loftus explains, quote, "They may start to remember a little bit about it, but when they come back a week later, they're starting to remember more. Maybe they will talk about the older woman who rescued them. Over time, more and more details appeared into the false memory, and the subject said that the old lady was wearing this crazy hat, and I had my favorite toy with me, and my mom was so mad." and it was entirely made up. So not only was it possible to implant completely false memories in the brain, but the subjects also embraced and integrated these memories as part of their identity, unknowingly weaving fantasy into the story of their reality and lives. And sometimes, even more subtle cues can manipulate our perception of reality. There are a bunch of funny but also strange studies about how, if, for example, a subject looks at a picture of a stranger while holding a warm mug of tea in their hand, and then is asked to describe what is their first impression of a stranger based on facial expressions, then they will describe them as friendlier and kinder than if the subject is holding a cold mug, in which the case the stranger will seem more distant. Or if a subject has to talk in an experiment about their political opinions while there is a hand sanitizer next to them, their opinions will be more conservative as a consequence of the fact that the brain is subconsciously reminded of the fear of external threats. Or if a negotiation, for example, takes place, subjects sitting on soft chairs will be more flexible and open than those on hard chairs. All of these details seem minor, but they shape the story of how we perceive reality in ways we are not even aware of. And in the inner story of our reality, there are characters, for example, factors and mechanisms of the brain that we don't even know about. And our decisions, what we do and what we choose every day, are something that is equally influenced below the level of our awareness and that is subject to more external influence and manipulation than we realize. We constantly have the impression that we are rational beings with decisions anchored in logic, but we miss the huge role that emotions and affective states play in our decisions. And the decisions we make can differ from one case to another. Sometimes it can happen that we can resist temptations, that we can be motivated and energetic, we do not deviate from our goals. And in other cases, we procrastinate, give it into temptations, postpone the completion of tasks. We can be surprisingly different persons at different times. Our self is not one, but a collection of distinct states that can differ from one moment to the next. And the brain is anatomically a machine with multiple drives. And these drives are in constant competition to be at the helm of our behavior. So let's say that we are at a party and we are offered cake. We have brain networks that want the energy and pleasure that the sugar in the cake will give us. So these neurons intensify their activity, fighting for dominance at the cerebral level and grouping into the neural network that wants cake. On the other hand, other brain networks care about our health, our weight, how fit we are, and these networks don't want us to eat the cake, so they will bring to the conscious mind all the reasons why we should not eat it. In the brain, there is a constant battle of neural networks that analyze details, combine patterns of information, analyze past experiences, and try to predict outcomes based on them. And from these battles, a decision results that will ultimately shape our behavior. Sometimes things can be more complex, and the outcome may not consist of a decision that we make or don't make, but we can choose to do something with a condition. For example, I eat cake today, but tomorrow I will go to the gym. The distinct networks of the brain want different things at different moments, and the conscious mind is like a CEO at the top of this process, whose purpose is to integrate and resolve this battle, to make the final decision about what behavior we choose. But even so, the conscious mind only sees a very small part of the details, and as we saw earlier with how memory can be manipulated, the conscious mind is particularly sensitive and foolish to such details. There is a striking difference between how perception is actually processed at the level of neural mechanisms and how simplistic the experience of perception is for us. The brain does an immense job and is careful to hide any clues that would reveal the fact that there is more to it than we can perceive. And the story of perception is even more interesting because what we call perception is based on a large extent on the predictions that the brain makes about what is going to happen next. The brain builds an internal model of reality that it tries to make as accurate as possible based on the information it receives. but it doesn't actually process all the information that is out there. Before reaching the back of the brain in a region that is called the occipital lobe, the visual information has to travel first to an intermediate multisensory processing structure that is called the thalamus, or more specifically through a structure of the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus. And here's where things take an interesting turn. The visual cortex in the occipital lobe sends its predictions first about what it is going to see out there to the lateral geniculate nucleus. And the lateral geniculate nucleus sends the information from the outside to the visual cortex, but not all the information, but only what the visual cortex couldn't predict. And this is called the prediction error. Not all the information about the entire scene out there will make it to the visual cortex, but only the information that was not already into the system. If what is happening around remains relatively stable and unchanged, there is no need for the occipital lobe to constantly receive the same signals. Only when something unpredictable happens, the thalamus will send a strong burst of information. Perception is therefore an experience that has more to do with what is happening inside and what the brain predicts, rather than just what is actually happening outside. So what we see has much more to do with our internal model. Multiple observers can look at the exact same scene and see different things and have a different experience, because we all look for different things in the world and we are constantly exposed to more or less predictable things. So our internal model will have a change to expand or stay the same. Our experience of reality is more of what the brain constructs internally, subjectively, than a completely objective view of reality. And what we consider correct or relevant can change over time because we change, and what we look for in the world and what we seek and the process changes in turn. And as we've seen along the way, some of the most basic things we do in terms of how we recall memories and how we draw conclusions about what we've remembered, in terms of whether we perceive a stranger as kind or distant, or whether or not we are flexible in the negotiation, can be influenced by details that seem tiny to have any influence to us, but they do. And let's not just talk about the influence that subtle cues have on our perception. There are much bigger things that influence us on a whole other scale. Our judgmental errors, our beliefs, our perceptions, our cultural biases, what we accept as true or not, all of this prime the brain to follow a certain perceptual trajectory that will shape what information is and is not relevant to our internal model. If all of these things in terms of our openness to other viewpoints and our beliefs become sufficiently limited or flawed, there could be evidence right in front of us that contradicts what we believe, and yet we wouldn't see it. There is an interesting phenomenon called the confirmation bias, and it refers to the simple fact that the brain actively seeks evidence to support what we already believe. In other words, evidence in favor of our viewpoint, and not the evidence that could support another point of view or that could contradict our viewpoint. And there are also other many biases. For example, take the illusory truth effect, a principle that explains the phenomenon of why people tend to believe false information after repeated exposure to it, even if they were initially able to identify the information as false. In other words, if you repeatedly expose your brain to something and you constantly see it, and this idea is exposed to you, you will believe that is more true than something it has not exposed to. But why? Because of the illusion of familiarity. The brain loves what is familiar because it is safe, so simple and convenient explanation will be more advantageous to the brain and therefore more satisfying to believe. The brain cannot stand uncertainty, and the difficulty of finding the answer to a question creates discomfort, which is also called cognitive dissonance. The brain wants to minimize or escape this discomfort as quickly as possible, because uncertainty is not for the weak. So if it is presented with a simple, sufficiently appealing and plausible hypothesis, and it's presented to it repeatedly, it may accept it, even though that hypothesis is false. And this is the principle that makes conspiracy theories so successful, because they satisfy the brain's need to remove uncertainty from the story. And despite the momentary relief, there is a hard price to pay for believing in conspiracy theories, namely not getting to know the actual truth. Because most of the time, the truth is more complex, or it takes more points of view or twists to get to it. And for that, a greater patience, ability to tolerate uncertainty, and flexibility in the internal model are needed. And as we have seen, the brain can be fooled very easily. Use a different word when you ask a question, and the brain will remember a memory differently. Make up a false story that sounds plausible and familiar, convince the subject that is true, and there is a good chance that they will remember it. And that is not all. Let's also think about optical illusions, for example. They are able to trick the visual system and the interpretation that the brain gives to the visual information. Our brains rely on patterns and past experiences and context to make sense of what we see, and illusions exploit these principles and processes to create a mismatch between what we see and how our brain interprets it. And this happens far beyond what the conscious mind can access, because the mere fact that we know something is an illusion does not prevent us from perceiving the illusion. And there are some illusions that are cognitively penetrable, meaning that we can sometimes change them by thinking about it, while other illusions are cognitively impenetrable, meaning no amount of thinking will change anything about our perception. Why are some illusions penetrable and others are not? We don't yet have a complete story on this, but what it does show us is that the way we perceive reality is something decided and constructed far beyond what we decide or control. What I also find beautiful is that our perception of reality is something unique, individual, and that beyond the differences in our perception represented by the individuality of the different beliefs and opinions that we have, there are also deeper ways in which brains construct reality differently. For example, the famous writer Vladimir Nabokov experienced something slightly strange. He associated letters and numbers with specific colors, and he described this as color hearing, perceiving letters as having inherent colors even when printed in black and white. And this is currently experienced by approximately 4% of the population. It is not a disease, but is a different perceptual experience known as synesthesia. The brains of these people show greater connectivity between the brain areas that process writing and numbers and colors, and therefore a much richer perceptual experience results. Or think about something that we all have, and it is called visual imagery vividness. In other words, how accurately we can visualize something in our minds. There is a spectrum that can be anywhere from no imagery at all, and it is called aphantasia, to movie-like imagery that is called hyperphantasia. And it is basically how we imagine, daydream, and think about things. Some of us think purely conceptually, aphantasia, and others in dynamic visual experiences, hyperphantasia. Or think about the famous neurologist Oliver Sacks. He is known for his extraordinary books and his contributions to the field, but he's also known for another problem he had. He couldn't recognize faces. He couldn't recognize familiar faces, and he couldn't even recognize people who were close to him by their faces, and yet his visual system was perfect. He had something called prosopagnosia, and it's due to the damage to the regions of the brain that specialize in facial recognition, areas like the occipital face area and the fusiform face area. And this is due to the damage of these regions and is something that more patients experience. And what all of this shows us is that the way reality can be constructed by the brain is a mind-blowing, complex, and ever-changing story. And reality is everything we perceive, both internally and externally, and yet we don't perceive all of it. So now to wrap up, I have some conclusions and some things to learn from this journey through perception. So relive your memories from your lifetime and treat memory with awareness of how imprecise and constantly changing it can be. Don't assume something is true just because it is similar, it seems familiar or plausible, and especially don't assume it's true just because you've heard it many times. Embrace the uncertainty of not always having the answer, and be open and aware of the beauty of the fact that everyone's brains construct reality slightly differently, and that it's a wonderful cognitive exercise to try to understand someone else's point of view. So now, if you have any questions or discussions. Okay, so here's a question. If our brains can be tricked by illusions and shaped by beliefs, how can we ever be sure that what we perceive is real? That's a very good question. We do perceive reality through our senses, and what we know is that indeed the reality out there is very different than what we actually perceive, because reality actually has no color in it. Everything we see as color are electromagnetic waves that hit the retina and then are interpreted by the brain as colors. But there are some sort of stimuli that somehow are out there in the reality, but the brain actually constructs it. So illusions are just a way of showing us that reality can be sometimes relative, and things can be seen in many different ways. But we have to assume that what we perceive is real, and that we can improve our perception and the accuracy of our perception of reality by looking at optical illusions and studying the neuroscience of perception. And yes. This is actually a very good question, and also René Descartes talked about that a lot, about this question, that what if everything we see is not actually real, and there are many variations on this, like what if we live in a dream and the reality is not real. So this is a highly debated question in neuroscience, actually. And yes.
Okay, if that is it from the questions, we can conclude the session. If there are any more questions, please leave them in the chat box, or we'll conclude the session. Thank you so much, by the way. That was a lovely session.
Thank you so much for joining us.